Tonight it is my pleasure to introduce Anand Giridharadas. I'm so sorry again. Anand is the New York Times columnist. He writes Admit One column for the arts section and the Letter from America for the Times Global edition. He has also written occasional pieces for the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, and elsewhere. He has been honored twice by the Society of Publishers in Asia for opinion and feature writing, by the South Asian Journalists Association for business reportage, and by the Indo-American Society for promoting cross-cultural understanding. His previous book is called India Calling, An Intimate Portrait of a Nation's Remaking. And his new book, The True American, tells the story of an immigrant campaign to spare from the death penalty the white supremacists who tried to kill him. Anand will be interviewed by Melissa Bell, a co-founder of the news site Vox.com.
Very important. Vox, not Fox.
Very important, yes. And where she's also executive editor. And I understand this is actually a tradition, this interview. So I will just, without further ado, give the mics to our guests.
Thank you. It's a tradition in the sense that this is the second time this has happened, but I did
In
this.
journalism, that counts as a trend, right? Yeah.
But I'm always so excited to get to talk to Anand about his work. I'm a big fan, and I'm also a big friend. We met years ago in India when we were both covering the country, and I have felt very lucky to call him and his wife Priya friends of mine, close friends of mine. So to start, I wanted to just begin with a reading. I was lucky enough to hear Anand give a reading in New York a few weeks ago, and I just have to warn the crowd that it brought me to tears. So I can't, I just hope that it will not bring you to the tears exactly, but affect you in the same way. So go ahead.
This is from the very close to the beginning of the book, so you haven't missed too much. And all you need to know is that a young Bangladeshi man has come to America, spent a couple years in New York, and is now moved to Dallas because he learned that the bathrooms there were as big as the bedrooms in New York, and is working in a gas station, even though he's an Air Force officer, former Air Force officer back in his birth country, but is toiling in this gas station 12, 13, 14 hours a day because he sees, as so many immigrants over the centuries have, something bigger for himself on the horizon. It's September 21st, 2001. The man in the entrance immediately seized Race's attention. Race is our character. Because of the red bandana around his mouth. He wore a wife beater, shorts, a black baseball cap, and wraparound sunglasses that concealed the very parts of his face Race might otherwise have probed for context. His arms were like massive hams, painted 360 degrees around with inscriptions. He was holding something black and shiny, which he seemed to wish to conceal from the people outside, but reveal to the man inside, to Race. Race's institutional memory was improving. I knew that this time he was not going to sell it to me, because nobody sells guns in the store. They come to rob you. Now the man was walking into the store toward the counter. Now he was just feet from Race on the other side. Proximity revealed that yes, that shiny black thing was a gun. A double-barreled pistol, it seemed. The man pointed it at Race's head. Oh no, again robbing today, Race thought. Oh, Texas, it was becoming a major irritation. I know the drill, Race said, that I have to open the cash register, open the cash, give him the money, and just stay safe. Click, whoosh, the register opened. Race removed $150 or so, and placed it on the counter. He made the perfunctory noise about, please take the money, but don't hurt me. He knew his lines by heart now. He was getting good. But in this play, the other player seemed not to know his part. The money did not faze him. All he said was, where are you from? It was obvious to Race that this question had nothing to do with robbing. Maybe he hadn't heard the man right through his bandana. "Excuse me?" Race asked faintly. Even as he said this, he felt his spine become an icicle. "Oh my gosh, he's not here for money," Race said to himself. He took a step or two backward and turned his face away from the man. Then millions of bees came out of nowhere, and as though their last earthly hive had just been destroyed, began what felt like a synchronized mass stinging of Race's face. He heard the explosion afterward. The melody of his "excuse me" had been revealing enough. At first, he couldn't bring himself to believe it was a gunshot. "I wanted to give myself benefit of the doubt that I was not shot," he said. Race tried to reassure himself. "Maybe he shot some drink or something. Not me. I was not shot." He briefly wondered if he might be hallucinating. It took the sight of blood pouring from his head as if from a faucet to know what had happened. He screamed "Mom" to no one. He had the wherewithal to cup his hands around his head. "I thought that my brain was going to come out any moment. First blood, now the brain." But the soldier within him kept telling himself that this didn't make any sense. Blood was spilling out of his head, which meant he'd been shot, but a bullet fired into a man's head from an arm's length or two away will end him at once. Not only was Race alive, he was also somehow standing. Why in God's name was he standing? He considered the notion that he had already died, and that this was the transition to the afterward. Race now saw that the tattooed man was still in the store, just standing there gazing at his prey. What had somehow failed to occur the first time would surely occur the second. "If I don't pretend I'm dying, maybe he might shoot me again to make sure that I'm dead," Race reasoned. He had to play dead. He plunged to the floor into a small pool of his own blood. His mind was spinning through a reel of images. His beloved mother and father, his 7 brothers and sisters, his lovely Abida. He had promised her he wouldn't be gone long. Each picture lingered for a few seconds, as though in one of those laptop slideshows. The faces were somber and drooping, looking at him but unable to help, darkly resigned. They seemed to be on the other side of an invisible wall, watching him die. That he recognized this flickering of images from the movies, much as his icicle spine had accurately forecast danger a short while earlier, left Race especially worried. This was the Hollywood sign for looming death. He was vanishing. He could tell. He saw the pointed tombstones of a Muslim graveyard. He saw his own grave. The horizon drew closer. How many seconds were left? What a life it had been. Where all it had taken him.
I told you it was a tough, tough one. Before we go any further, I want to skip ahead in the book. And I don't want to say anything more than this is a conversation that happens many years later. And this is what happens in between is the magic in this book. But
this is the second time. What you just heard was the first time that a man named Race Bouillon interacted with a man named Mark Stroman. And for all of you who are coming in, there are still a few seats here and there, so be brave and come close. This is the second conversation ever between the same 2 men. And it's a transcript. Mark says, "Race, how are you doing, Race?" Race says, "Hey, Mark, how are you, buddy?" Mark says, "How are you doing, man? Hey, man, thank you for everything you have been trying to do for me. You are inspiring. Thank you from my heart, dude. Race says, Mark, you should know that I am praying for God, the most compassionate and gracious. I forgive you, and I do not hate you. I never hated you. Mark says, you are inspired, Race. Race says, and this is from the bottom of my heart. Mark says, you are a remarkable person. Thank you from my heart. I love you, bro. I love you with all my heart. Thank you for being such an awesome person. I mean it. Race says, you will always be there. Mark says, you touched my heart. I would have never expected this. Race says, you touched mine too. Mark says, hey Race, they are telling me to hang up now. I will try to call in a minute. But Mark Stroman would not be able to call back because he was summoned away at that very hour to get ready for the execution that was scheduled of him that evening, an execution that Race Bhuiyan was in the middle that very evening of seeking to prevent.
This is a story of two men from two sides of the planet colliding into each other's lives, and the changes that both of them had on each other. It's a story of murder. Two other men were killed in the shooting rampage that Mark took on Dallas 10 days after 9/11, in what he saw as retribution for the terrorist attacks on New York and D.C. And what comes of it is a story of two men, Race and Mark, and how they responded to this event in their lives. And I know that, Anand, I wanted to sort of go back to the beginning of when you first discovered this story. You saw it in a newspaper. It was an article. And I want to just sort of have you take us back to that moment and sort of talk about what, obviously it's a very compelling moment and a compelling story, but what was it about it that reached out in this article to you that inspired you to write this book?
Like so many important things in America today, it began with Jon Stewart. And I had the fortune of going on his show during my first book tour, and the book was all about India and the kind of new hope and promise in India. And he has this amazing way of framing things that's both comedic but also just brilliantly succinct, which is why so many of us watch him. And he asked me this question he basically said, he summarized my whole book. I wish I'd said this in my book, I didn't. But he said, basically what you're saying is the American dream is alive and well, but it's just alive and well in India. And by that point, I had moved back to America after 6 years living in India, reporting on India. And there was this essential truth in what he said. And that truth actually became the seed of my quest for the next book. And I was back in America. I wanted to write a book about America. And it occurred to me that after trying to tell the story of the arrival in India of something like the American dream, centered on the individual, people feeling this confidence in being able to realize their dreams, that America was going the other way. And I spent a year and a half sort of plumbing around for different stories of that nature, but never found something that would allow me to explore that but still be a story, which is what I wanted. And one day I see a story in the newspaper that says a man named Mark Stroman is scheduled to be executed in Texas tonight. So far, pretty normal story. In his final days, his victim, one of his victims, Raisuddin Bhuiyan, story gets a little more interesting, has been fighting to save his life. Story gets a lot more interesting. That was 9 a.m. I was reading the New York Times. It was a news brief in the Times on my iPad in bed in Cambridge, Massachusetts. That was kind of compelling enough to move to more powerful technology of my laptop in another room and say, this needs a little more research than can be done on an iPad. And by 11 a.m., I called out to Priya in the other room and said, I have the second book. Because, and what happened between by 9 I already knew the basic arc of one man shoots another man, the other man forgives that man and fights to save his life, which on its own is just an astonishing tale. But what happened between 9 and 11 was I realized that every major thread that you and I as journalists would want to write about in America today, from debt to healthcare to tolerance to the way, the collapse of the American family to the disparity between the coasts and the heartland, meth, addiction, all kinds of things. Any issue that you were interested in was in this story. And just doing a nexus search between 9 and 11, I had seen references to basically all those storylines. And I just thought, this is going to be the kind of story where if you just tell what happens to this small group of people, it's a true story, you will be able to talk about this moment in American life very broadly.
I think to narrow in on one of those, I was speaking to him earlier tonight, and I was talking about how I feel like Anand's a little bit of a dream chaser. He chases the dreams of India. He's now chasing the dreams in America. And one of the things that comes out of this is really that the American dream is still very much alive for certain people. And it's usually very much alive for immigrants. When you live abroad and you speak to people, the dream of coming to America and the power of what this country is so very alive in people abroad. And when you come here and you speak to people who live here, are born here, especially in impoverished communities, the American dream is very much not alive. And I think I want to narrow in on some of the lessons that you learned from the previous book to this book, and how that reporting on India influenced the reporting here, and what you sort of picked up from the two transitions.
I think, and then many people here from, many people who I know, because my parents are good at bringing their friends, who come from immigrant backgrounds. And will know this instinctively, that I think one of the very strange things about poverty in America is that if you go to a place like India or Nigeria or China, if you are poor, you are more likely than rich people to have community around you. There's sort of this resources versus community trade-off in poor countries. So if you want to really make it big and you get that big penthouse in Mumbai or Lagos, you tend to be more cut off from family than the average person in Lagos or Mumbai. And you tend to kind of not live with your parents when they're old. And there's this trade-off between making it big, striking it out on your own, versus like being part of this tribe. In America, for a very complicated set of reasons, the poorer you are, the less access to family and community you have. And I don't think we think about how weird this is, right? So what happens in a poor country is, if you don't have resources, you use community to do the things that rich people achieve through resources. So if you have resources, you get childcare through the market, and if you don't, you get childcare through aunts and brothers and sisters and grannies. But in America, if you don't have resources, so you can't buy childcare on the market, and you're less likely to be married, less likely to have that form of backup, less likely to have community and social capital of all kinds. And so these advantages multiply. And rich people have more community and more backup. And poor people have a much higher divorce rate, much lower family formation rates. Men are basically, an enormous percentage of men are, away in jail at any given time. Like a percentage that is actually stunning when you go to some of these communities. And you start to have this situation where people are alone when they're poor. And the poorer you get, the more alone you get. And so what happened in this story was, you have an immigrant from a very poor country who arrives in America, but has these habits of community formation, even though he comes by himself without family. But he's able to recreate family. And when he gets shot, people are dropping off medical samples and throwing him a few bucks for doctor's visits and offering him to sleep on a sofa for a year. Right? So he's able to recreate high social capital, to use the kind of academic jargon for it, within a very small period of arriving here. And because, if he was not shot, he may have never realized how anybody else lived. A lot of immigrants, to be honest, can be quite blind to how this other demographic lives, because they're not part of your lives. Even the people who may clean your home are also immigrants, right? But this kind of native-born West Virginians just may not be part of your consciousness. But he got to know this other America because he was shot by someone from this other America. He attended the trial of that person and saw all of their friends testify about their childhoods. He then worked at the Olive Garden because his dream of working in IT got derailed. So now he's working at the Olive Garden, in part, as he put it, to overcome his fear of white people. And he is exposed to native-born working-class Americans who work at the Olive Garden and realizes that almost to a person, they have nobody in their lives. They have nobody to pick them up and drop them off from work. They don't have cars because no one will co-sign a lease. They have the money for the lease, but they don't have a person in their life who will co-sign. What is co-signing? The boring financial thing. But it means someone saying they have your back, right? And so he is stunned to arrive in a country that actually works for him even though he was shot, but so fails all these people who have the fortune of being born here.
I think that this is one thing that comes up throughout the book is it's the many attempts in different ways that America tries to combat the issues that arise with poverty, that also arise with immigration. Mark, the native-born American, as you call him, is frustrated by the fact that he sees immigrants as getting things from the country that he was not able to get. And there's also this idea that there are a number of times that the government tries to intercede in Mark's life throughout his childhood. Jail is set up in a sense to help reform him. There's a number of government interventions. And I think that this is something that is this constant ongoing attempt to aid and elevate people. And yet it's very clear that these are not that these systems do not work. That there is a community in this country that is that falls in between the cracks in our society. And it's interesting to me to sort of see what is happening in this society, that there's government intervention happening from one side, and there's this idea that you can pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and neither seem to be working for this community. So,
I think one of the things that's very interesting is, if you were to take most people in this room and in this zip code, although we have this big argument about the market versus the state, actually, for most of us in this room, both the market and the state work pretty well. We can gripe about our government, but we basically have one of the most effective governments, if you actually think about all the little things the government does, in the history of the world. And the market works pretty well for most people in this zip code. But there are a bunch of people for whom maybe only the state works well and the market doesn't work well, and a bunch of people who only the market works well and the state is not so great. But there are these people like Mark Stroman for whom neither works well. And community doesn't work well either as a third leg on that stool. And so if you look at Mark Stroman's childhood, he's born into kind of white working class family in exurban Dallas. It's kind of been this 3-generation story of declines. Grandfather owned a company, parents a little more struggling, he's really struggling. Addiction is everywhere. Everybody's addicted. Almost no dad stays. Dads are there until pregnancy happens, if that makes any sense. Pregnancy is the time when dads tend to move on to less pregnant pastures. And that's just the rule. And then occasionally a guy stays because maybe he overslept or something. And so nobody has a dad. Nobody has, parents who are like available. I mean, forget the thing about do you teach your kids 10,000 words before they're 4. This is like, do you not abuse your child and not, and you have very few people who just make it out of that. Speaking of perfect children, Genevieve. Hi. Best niece ever. And so by, it's easy to blame the schools, but a kid enters school, 5 or 6? Most of these kids are ruined by 5 or 6 by this whole situation. Then they pass to the second institution after the family and community of the schools. And we all know what's happening with that. And the other day, Priya and I were on the subway, and there's this guy doing this, teenager doing this like very elaborate stuff in the very early morning, and we realize he's got all the test score results on his phone, and he's copying them onto a white piece of paper, which is conveniently sleeve-sized, and that's how standardized tests are going to be passed that day, you know. And so there's a whole school failure thing, which we all know about. And then the third major institution for a lot of these boys is the prison system. And so we have 2.3, I think, million people in prison right now. The more interesting number to me, I think that number is very misleading, because Mark Stroman, for example, was completely formed by prison, but he was only in prison probably less than a year in his entire life, right? So the 2.3 million number captures who's there now. I don't know if anyone's done the number on, like, what's the alumni association of massive incarceration? Is it 20 million? Is it 40 million? And so, you know, and Mark Stroman, there was no evidence that he was racist until he went to prison. All of his friends said he was just kind of a generally awful guy, but all this specific rhetoric about the blacks this and the Latins this and whatever, it all go out of prison, because that's how you survive in prison. So just these three institutions of a collapsing family structure with addiction and all those issues, and men failing, a school system, and then this prison system. For a lot of these guys, there's not really, and it is guys, by the way, the whole way women are able to not become terrible going through these same three things is a very interesting subject in its own right. And these guys just don't have a shot.
I know that at some point we want to open up questions to the audience, so I don't want to take up too much time, more time, but I do want to turn a little bit to your writing, and specifically how you chose to approach this book. I found it just really graceful in many places. I was just so impressed with how you were able to hint at bigger issues through the language that you chose. And one thing that I thought was so compelling, it's a story of two men, and they're two very different men. And you actually changed your language as a narrator just enough to let the reader wear the skin of the different characters a little bit. And I noticed that I sort of picked it up a little bit in the beginning with Race's character, and it's a little easier to sort of pick up these beautiful nuances that come when someone's a non-English speaker and speaking the English language, and there's just these sort of beautiful the accidents of language that happen. At one point, he talks about how soft his heart is, and as someone who is raised in the English language, we always talk about how hard our hearts are, and I loved that he came up with the opposite of that in such a beautiful way. But it really struck me in some of the passages about Mark and his life, and at one point, there was one point that I'm just going to read out, and I feel terrible in front of your niece now. I can't read out the whole thing. I'm gonna. Okay.
Cover your ears.
So I actually, I mean, when I read this, I do want to warn people that the language is it really made me uncomfortable reading it, and so it's going to make me uncomfortable saying it.
I can read that Melissa's note in the margin is, "I feel uncomfortable."
So I really did. But this was, Anand approaches this as a reporter, and so he's writing in a way that he's completely removed from the story. He's never involved in it, but so he's writing in third person. But it still took on the auspices of the language around him. So this is someone, a friend of Mark's, who was uncomfortable with Mark, was previously his boss, and was actually very involved in the murders, identifying Mark as a candidate, a suspect. So he said, aside from a few red flags that Tom Boston somehow minimized at the time, like the time they lost a $1 rental account because a company hotshot happened to be visiting Dallas. He happened to be black, and Mark happened to call him a fucking nigger. The boss was thrilled with his new hire. Now, that to me...
So why does it make you feel uncomfortable?
For so many reasons. I think that it took, and this is why I found it so compelling, was because you it's so casual the racism is so casual in that and so subtle in that. And by repeating that happened, you as a writer are making me surrounded by people who talk that way and don't pick up on the racism in it. And that's really what struck me about that. So I wanted you to sort of talk about the process of figuring out how to balance those two tones, and what you sort of went through with that.
So I'm so glad. Like, I've done this now for a month on the road, and no one's picked up on this besides you. But I would say that what may feel like a very technical question about writing, this is at the heart of what I tried to do in this book. And when I was starting and talking with Priya about how do I conceptualize this, how do I do this trick, which I'll explain in a second, was like on my top 3 things that I wanted to achieve with the book, as technical and arcane as it may seem. And it's part of a technique that's, some of you may know, called free and direct discourse. There's different words for it. The close third person is another. But it basically has to do with when, as a narrator, who's a third person narrator, I'm not one of the characters, you in some places annihilate the distance between you and one of your characters and almost start mimicking them, almost as though you're them. And that's fine in the very pleasant passages. So I do it in a few places where I say, race would be home, inshallah, by March. Now, it's very clear that I'm not Muslim, and I wouldn't say inshallah all the time, and I'm the narrator, but it's kind of obvious what's going on in that context, that I'm just trying to get you to think like race, even though it's me talking, it's him thinking. Mm-hmm. It's his idea that he'll be home by November. But here, the thing that's weird here, and I remember doing it, was repeating the word happened 3 times. Because happened, I'm minimizing. I'm now implicated in the racism by saying the word he just happened to call him that, right? And it's playing with fire a little bit. But part of the reason I felt it was important is the story here is quite simple. What is hard is for you to actually inhabit each of these worlds equally, right? Because white people from Stephenville, Texas will very easily maybe identify with Mark Stroman and not at all identify with Mark if I don't equalize it. And immigrants in Washington, D.C. may very easily empathize with race and not at all with Mark. So I felt my work was to actually redistribute the empathy a little bit for everybody. And part of doing that is to help you understand how for Tom Boston, in Tom Boston's social world, a guy saying things like that is so normal that it wouldn't qualify as a red flag 10 years later when that guy shoots a bunch of brown people. That Tom Boston, I actually believe Tom Boston, that although Mark would also say, he would say, hey Mark, what are you doing this weekend? And he would say, I'm going N-word hunting in Oak Cliff. You want to come? Tom Boston also minimized that. And at first I just thought this guy's lying. He clearly knew that this guy was a killer all along, and maybe the guy's killed 40 people. But as I went along, I actually think this was a social world where it was so normal to talk and think that way that you could hear that for 10 years, become numb to it, and I wanted you to feel the normalcy of it.
And that's what you did make me feel. And I think that's why it makes me so uncomfortable, is because it made it more true. I knew better, I think, in that way, that and that I got to know these people. And that, I think, was the point of this book. And I think that the point of the book is actually 2 men getting to know each other that didn't know each other at all. And I think that, like, what is so powerful about it is figuring out how you identify strangers, because so much of our suspicions of each other's lie in fear. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about this, because I think that writers often write about characters that in some ways they identify with, and they write about characters that they see there's something about themselves in there. There's a reason that there's sort of like that you're wrestling with this idea. So can you talk a little bit about like how you identify with the 2 characters?
So I think, obviously race is the easy one, but he's not the only one. So, for race, I think there's two levels for me. I think race, in some ways, the basic trajectory of his life is more like my parents' trajectory. My parents are here in the front row as well. I always like to pack the front row with easy supporters. And so his trajectory is more like theirs, that kind of bungee jump from some other country to this other country you know nothing about, being willing to embrace the risk, being willing to, lose access to resources to gain them later. The daredevil nature of that is something I know, from my parents' life more than my own. But also in race, just, I think, again, speaking of this zip code, this is an ambitious zip code, and I grew up, this is a guy who's always looking for the next thing, as I think so many of us in this room are, and trying to get education and trying to be smarter and faster and thinner every day than the day before, and more gluten free, so I think that was easy. Mark, again, was harder work for me, and I then had to make it understandable for you. But it's not that there's nothing. I think it's easy to call America a nation of immigrants. But if America was just like this empty place where, new people kept coming and there's nobody who'd ever been here a long time, and if you'd been here a long time, you were moved out, and then it wouldn't be a great country either. Part of what makes America work is this very delicate balance of all these new people socialized into an extraordinary system. And the extraordinary system is all the people who are already here, living in certain ways, following certain rules, right? So it's the Indian or the Nigerian who comes here and didn't obey the lines in his country who obeys them in this country, right? And pays taxes in this country he doesn't pay back where he came from. But it's the people here who did that training and teaching and are the preservers. So it's this amazing, delicate dance between who was here already in from some previous wave and who just came in the new wave. And I was able to empathize with that part of Mark Stroman that wanted to hold on to something and that feels threatened when, something new is coming. And, you now, Melissa had quite a bit of fame recently for starting this site Vox with Ezra Klein. And the same kind of terror that someone like you strikes into the heart of old media, it's true. I see it. I see it at the New York Times. I see it at, it's a feeling of being left behind by something, by anything, of being less relevant now than you were before, is the most terrifying feeling in the world. And it's the flip side of that feeling of endless possibility and a long horizon. And I don't think there's anyone here who hasn't felt that also in some moment. Some industry that you thought was going to be there forever that really didn't last that long. Maybe you went really long on CD-ROMs or, but that bitterness, I think the word bitterness, maybe none of us are as bitter as the animating principle of our life as Mark Stroman was. But we've all felt bitterness.
I could keep talking for hours, but I know that I want to ask some questions from the audience as well. So are there any people? There's a microphone here, and I think there's another one, or is there just one? Okay, just one. So if people want to line up here, or we can just keep talking. Any questions? Here. Yeah. Okay, I can. Go ahead. Oh, I can repeat the question too.
Oh. Now, I don't want to steal your limelight, but in the light of what you said, your title, The True American, intrigues me. Who is the true American? The Native American, the immigrant who brings in so much?
So the origin of the title is simply enough. This is how Mark Stroman signed all of his letters and blog posts and everything else. He called himself the True American. So, the same way you may say sincerely Kusum, he would say sincerely the True American Mark Stroman. It was his sign off, and it was one of the many moments of knowing that there was a book here when I just saw that phrase, and I knew that was the title from the beginning. And the reason I did is because my view of that phrase is the opposite of his view of that phrase. But I wouldn't say opposite. It's just more expansive. I think my view includes his view of it, and it includes another view of it. And I would, summarize those two views as there is a view of what a true American is as holding on to something, fundamentally about being holding on to something. And there's another view about a true American. That a true American is in a way new blood. And again, a body only of new blood may not be a very successful body. A body only of old blood may not. I think what's extraordinary about this country and makes it different from an India or a France or so many other places is actually, for all that we gripe, over the long run, getting this balance of new blood and old blood pretty well. And we err and we screw things up and we have to fix certain things. But in general, we've gotten more value out of new blood in this country without losing something essential. And there's all this alarm, the country's going to hell and this and that, and but we never do. This remains the same country, even as the photographs of, when you see those, here's what America looks like, here's what America's going to look like in 2040. The faces keep changing, the color keeps changing, right? Irish people were not considered white, now they're considered white. Germans were discriminated against, now Germans are on, all of that is like a sideshow. And we would all look back on the last 300 years of history and see some very deep continuity, even as the color of the hands have changed over and over and over again.
So I had one question, but I kind of am stuck on your talk of the bitterness in this, and I'm curious if it's just the two native-born Americans that have this bitterness, because I don't get the sense that race has that, and I'm wondering if that's something that you can comment on, if that is in essence like something that only Native Americans could have, is this sort of bitterness about,
No, it's a great question, but I think, in this book maybe, with just these, you can't extrapolate from just two people. There's another wonderful book out right now, which I've been hearing a lot about, I haven't read yet, by Akhil Sharma, which is all about an immigrant family that has tragedy in America, and it's kind of opposite trajectory. And I think, from what I've read, that story is a lot more about bitterness about having come here. And I think it's sometimes very easy to tell these immigrant stories as only upward stories. There's a lot of loss in the immigrant story. I mean, it's a kind of death to leave a country. It's like, it can be for some people like the death of a child or the death of a parent. I mean, it's something you accept and move on from, but it's a death. So it's not only that immigrants are happy-go-lucky, unbitter people, but it is a very self-selected group of people who chooses to get out of a country and comes here, and it may not be average emotional state. So you have these stories of Italians who, eight sons and daughters, and one ends up here. Well, I don't think it's a randomly distributed one. There was probably something, on the whole, something in the one brother or sister who left to come here, and I think that something has to do, again, on average, with a sunniness and optimism, maybe an obliviousness to what could go wrong.
My second question, and it might take your story into more of today's social discourse, but I'm really curious if you address, or if race's opinions change about gun control, and if that is a topic that, an impression that he had about America, and if that changed, or if that was something that you wanted to explore in this.
I mean, I think I've never actually talked to him about gun control specifically, but I think his view, which doesn't fall on either side of the gun control debate, I mean, it's a view that's compatible with either side, but his view is that we have a problem of souls and of people that's, we have an enormous number of broken people roaming around, and I don't think that view means that it's a bad idea to outlaw guns, but I think that view also supports the idea that outlawing guns alone is not going to get rid of your broken people. But I think he came to see that we have millions of young men in particular who don't love themselves, never really learn to love anybody else, and live and die alone, at least emotionally, if not always physically, and that in a way, the gun control conversation is very important, but it's it's part of a much bigger conversation about like how many broken people can a society tolerate? Because even when it doesn't become a mass shooting, it could still be a heroin epidemic in Vermont. Vermont, of all places. Sweet, tender little Vermont, right? They used to be doing pancakes and maple syrup over there. Now they're doing heroin. And that comes out of despair. And maybe some of the same people who are, could be candidates for doing mass shootings are instead doing heroin. But the fact that they don't do mass shootings is not a huge credit to our society if they're ruining their lives and other people's lives in some other way.
Anybody else? Is Race motivated more by religion, or is his participation in this defense his way of becoming an American, figuring the legal system out and doing all that stuff?
Wow, it's a great question that's at the heart of this book. And thank you for asking that. I think, in a way, not to minimize it, but it would almost be boring if it was only one of those things. And I had to I spent a long time thinking about his motivations, and I talked to him about it, but I had to, in a way, come to my own judgment of it independent of what he felt, because we're not always, honest with ourselves even about something like that. And my sense is what made it so interesting and fascinating to me was this amazing and in some ways very American combination of a deep spiritual, next worldly motivation and a deep pragmatic, this worldly motivation. And part of what's so amazing about him as a character, and you really see this develop, he kind of arrives as this, young, naive, extremely devout immigrant who really talks about the next world more than this one in some ways. And over the course of these years in America, he, without losing any of that, although he shaves off here and there when he realizes he's working at the Olive Garden, when he realizes 50% of tips come from alcohol, he kind of compromises on his unwillingness to sell it to people. Still doesn't drink it, but relaxes. He says, God wouldn't want me to starve. And so over these years, he acquires something of an American pragmatist and I would say even a bit of an American hustler. He knows how to get things done. He understood that doing this as opposed to some other act would get attention, that maybe someone would write a book about it, that it would help start a conversation, which is what he wanted to do. And so he has this amazing combination of a kind of saintly disposition, and a lot of people who meet him use the word saintly. But the guy knows how to work the situation also. And that to me makes him one of the great American characters that I've ever been able to encounter.
We actually have not spoken about this, but I hear a rumor that it's not going to just be a book. It was reported in the media that it may actually turn into a movie at some later date. I don't know if you can talk about that or not, but that's what it's reported on.
Why don't you share?
I read it on the internet, so I believe it to be true. But I'm sorry. There's another question. Go ahead.
No,
There's a
will.
rumor.
It will. It was in Hollywood Reporter, so it has to be half true. It is Catherine Bigelow's next movie, starring Tom Hardy. For those of you who are fans of Tom Hardy as Mark Stroman.
I think that this is a really interesting part of it because her previous book was touched on a lot of the issues of America at war after 9/11, and I think that this book is really about sort of the war that's happening in America as a result of a lot of things that happened there. So anyway, next question.
Well, speaking of race's evolution, so to speak, it makes me wonder how his being the center of a book and potentially a movie has affected or may affect him.
That's a great question. Part of the way I work is, kind of born out of the journalistic method. I mean, he didn't see any of this until 2 weeks before publication day in April. He didn't know. He said, I had no idea what you were going to write. I had no idea if you were going to, stoke the flames of Islamophobia to bring book sales. I just had no idea. I mean, you seem like a nice person. We met over 2 years, but I had no idea what you were going to write. So he was, I think, relieved when the book came out that it was a fairly faithful account of what happened. And he said, very sweetly, he said, I cried because I felt there was someone in the room for all those years of my life when I know there was no one else in the room. And that's also a testament to he has an extraordinary memory. You can't do these books if your characters don't have great memories, even if their story's great. You need to know what color socks they were wearing at their naturalization ceremony, and if and some people just don't remember stuff like that, and you can't write about them. So he's already, before this book, he had a lot of media attention around the time that he fought that campaign in July 2011. So I think that was a real moment, and I didn't know him at that point. That was a real moment of education for him. He did radio, he did TV, people came from around the world, and he really learned, and he's just a relentless learner. Year after year, he's just picked up a new skill. If he's not acquiring a new skill at any given time, I think he feels like he's falling backwards. And so he's just kind of taken this on as a new skill, and again, in this very American way, part of what I think makes it work and makes him not get arrogant or this and that is that he still has this very deep piety and this sense that all of this is tiny compared to something else. And I think that keeps him relatively grounded.
Another question coming
I
up.
just want to follow up on that. It'd be very American that he now has gotten himself a job in an area he wants to. Has he been able to take his 15 minutes of fame and turn it into something more long-lasting, do you think? I mean,
What's so interesting, I wonder this. his job is hard. He works extraordinary hours. When I send him an email of fact-checking emails for the book, I would send it at, whatever day I'd send it, I'd get it 2 days later a response at 3 and 4 in the morning. So he would write, he would take the 10 minutes to respond to me after he'd finished his workday at 3 in the morning. So he's a database administrator. He lives in Tom Friedman's world, so in the world Tom Friedman created, we may say, which is a world where he is living in a house in Murphy, Texas. He works for a very big internet travel company, but he's gotten permission to work from home most days, so he can run a bit of a campaign on these issues of mercy in his free time. And from his house in Murphy, Texas, through the internet and the phone, which rings every 5 minutes, he manages a team of server engineers in Austria, and the servers are in London. I told you this is a Tom Friedman book, or at least 5 columns, and he's kind of in this kind of weightless world. And again, it's a kind of interesting thing because it's such a contrast with the world of this other family he got to know. And one of the things I should mention is he not only tried to save Mark Stroman's life, but as part of his understanding of the kind of economic separation between him and that world, he started sending money to Mark Stroman's children through Western Union in the hope that he could prevent them from not becoming their father.
I think he has then. He has done it.
You talk about Mark in the context that he's the product of his circumstances, but doesn't there come a time where you're responsible for your own actions?
Absolutely, and that's, I think that question is actually at the heart of the book, and I think part of what happens in this country and a lot in this city is we are forced to have very polarized debates, not just between left and right, but on anything. And so this question of, are people responsible for their fates, or are they victims of circumstance? Like, the word "or" is the problem there, right? So it's very clear that Mark Stroman comes out of a world where just statistically, boys don't end up being decent men at any level of probability, right? But if you read this book, or you read anything about Mark Stroman or these other guys, it's very clear that Mark Stroman's like a bone-rotten murderer. There's nothing redeemable about him either, although he sort of becomes a better man in prison and has his own arc. But I think part of what was important for me was being able to just hold these two ideas at the same time. He's completely a victim of his circumstances, and he's completely responsible for everything he became and did. And neither cancels out the other. that he is a terrible person who, you know, he had 2 sisters who never did anything terrible. So his circumstances, however bad they are, didn't cause everybody who, who endured them to become murderers. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't, as a society, try to have some collective response to the situation. And the fact that, you know, maybe as more liberals would more emphasize, there is a collective problem and a collective situation, doesn't mean we shouldn't hold people responsible. And the kind of phrase that came to me, I don't know if it's in the book or not anymore, because a lot of things go out and fall in. But it struck me at some point that in contrast to our very polarized national debates, the real story here for people like him is actually the interaction of having few choices and making bad choices. And liberals like to emphasize people have too few choices, and conservatives like to emphasize that people make bad choices, and no one can be honest that what if both things happen? You have fewer choices if you're poor and if you're unfortunate, and maybe you make some of those choices that you do have that are all the more important wrong.
I think if nobody else has questions, I think that that's a really good thought to end on. Thank you so much for letting me
Thank
participate
you.
again. This is really fun.